You were never meant to hear this. The following account was buried under 100 years of silence, sealed by family names, more powerful than the law. And yet today, you are hearing it, because what was found beneath that farmhouse in Virginia was not just a crime. It was a blueprint for control. Spring of 1834. Henrio County, Virginia. A storm rolls over the hills. A farmhouse sits quietly on the outskirts of a sleepy rural settlement. To the outside world, it was a simple home. 2 floors, white clapboard siding, a porch with a rocking chair that never stopped moving. But below that house, beneath the floorboards, was a world built on silence and suffering. The kind of place you don't speak about. The kind of place you don't survive. 47 children, chained to stone walls in a hand-dug basement so deep it hummed with the sound of the earth itself. They did not cry out when the sheriff found them, because most had forgotten how to speak. They didn't scream because they knew no one was coming. And when asked their names, each whispered the same word. Mother, Mother Sullivan. To understand how this happened, you have to step back. Look deeper, not just at the horror, but at the system that enabled it. Because this was not just about one family. This was a structure, planned, funded, protected, hidden in plain sight. And it began, as it always does, with kindness. Constance Sullivan, soft-spoken, dark hair pulled into a bun, a woman of the church, a caretaker of orphans. Or so they believed. She baked bread for the pastor, taught scripture to the school children, and claimed she was housing poor family kin from Pennsylvania. No one asked too many questions, because evil never arrives with fangs. It arrives in disguise, with a gentle smile, and a voice that tells you everything is under control. But something was wrong. People just couldn't see it. Not yet. The basement was not a secret because it was high, ye den underground. It was a secret because it was buried inside the mind of a town that didn't want to know. Millbrook, a farming town so small it barely had a name on the map. 50 families, 1 church, 1 general store, and 1 myth they all believed: that they were safe. The Sullivan farmhouse sat on 200 acres of good Virginia land. To anyone passing through, it was unremarkable. Painted white, 2 chimneys, a red barn, a wraparound porch that creaked when no one walked on it. But those who lived nearby began to notice things, unusual things. Things that only made sense in hindsight. Why were the Sullivan lights on so late? Why did they need so much food? Why did the children never come into town? The answers came slowly, hints carved into ordinary days, like whispers scratched behind wallpaper. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the general store, remembered seeing little faces in the Sullivan wagon, never speaking, always watching. Constance would smile and say, "They're shy. They've been through so much. They just need time." Dr. Whitfield, the traveling physician. He remembered being called out to the Sullivan home more than once. Each time he'd be stopped at the door. Constance would describe symptoms, ask for medicine, but never let him see the children. "They're too frightened. They've been through trauma. Please, doctor, trust me." And he did. Everyone did. Because what they saw on the surface was what they wanted to believe. A God-fearing couple, taking in orphans, doing the Lord's work. No one saw the iron rings embedded in stone. No one saw the records, the ledgers, the lists of names, and the words that broke the soul of every investigator: condition, age, disposition, compliant or uncooperative. Because you see, this wasn't just cruelty. It was a system. It was business. It ran for over 20 years, invisible, because the devil doesn't hide in shadows. He hides in rituals, in routine, in what looks like virtue. The Sullivan home was not a place of charity. It was a mechanism a machine designed to turn human beings into silence. And the town let it happen, because the lie was easier to swallow than the truth that burned underneath. By 1834, the Sullivan operation had already swallowed more than 2 decades, years of silence, years of obedience enforced by chains and terror. The basement was not simply a place. It was an engineered reality, built brick by a man who understood that darkness thrives underground. Ezra Sullivan purchased the land in 1809, inherited money from a tobacco dynasty. He paid cash, no banks, no records, just a man with a vision no one else could see. While most homes had a root cellar, Ezra spent years expanding the basement, not out, but down. Craftsmen were brought in from neighboring counties, paid well, paid in silence. None saw the finished layout. Each man worked on a separate section. Each man left thinking he had built a wine cellar, a storeroom, a drainage system. But Ezra knew what he was building. He was carving a sanctum into the earth, a place where light would never reach, where screams would never echo past the stone. Neighbors thought he was eccentric. Constance explained it away with perfect charm. They were accommodating orphans, doing their Christian duty, nothing to see, nothing to question. And no one did, because to question meant responsibility. To question meant confronting the rot beneath polite society. What made the Sullivan deception so complete, so devastating, was that it didn't rely on hiding. It relied on trust, on playing the role of good neighbors, reliable customers, church-going citizens. The children came one by one. Some brought in wagons, some arrived by foot, always at night, always unseen. They were told this was a refuge, a second chance, a home. What they found instead were chains embedded in stone, iron rings too cold to touch, and voices that stopped screaming because screaming never worked. Ezra built the walls, Constance built the lies, and the town built the silence that wrapped around all of it. This was not the work of monsters. This was the work of people, of systems, of obedience. And if you think this was just a story from the past, you're already standing at the edge of a deeper truth. There's a reason you've never heard about Millbrook, Virginia in your history classes. A reason why no school textbook will mention the Sullivan family. Because this isn't history that comforts. This is history that exposes. And exposure is a threat to those who need control. Millbrook was a quiet settlement. 50 families, a church, a general store, and a one-room schoolhouse that doubled as a meeting hall. People lived simply. They prayed openly, and they trusted the faces they saw every Sunday morning. That trust was the first link in the chain. The Sullivan farmhouse stood just outside the town perimeter. 2 stories, federal style, white clapboard siding, a wraparound porch with a rocking chair that never creaked. On the surface, it looked like every other farm in Virginia. But the surface was a lie. Beneath the house was something crafted for containment, a structure not of wood, but of control. Lights were seen at strange hours. Hammering echoed late into the night. But no one asked questions, because asking would have meant pulling at a thread, and that thread ran straight through the entire town. The Sullivans didn't just deceive individuals, they engineered a false reality. They told the community they were housing orphans, relatives from Pennsylvania, victims of hardship and plague, and people believed them because the lie fit the story they wanted to hear. Constance played the role so perfectly, it became truth. She bought medicine for invisible children, food for invisible mouths, clothing for invisible bodies. No one ever saw the children, but everyone assumed they were real, because she gave them just enough to believe. One child's shoe seen in a wagon, a tiny face glimpsed behind curtains, a cough heard on the wind, enough to create the illusion of life, enough to silence the voice of suspicion. This is how the most sinister operations survive, not through secrecy, but through performance, through the obedience of a population trained not to look too closely. And in that obedience, monsters find sanctuary. You need to understand something deeper now. The Sullivan basement was not just a prison for children. It was a machine built to erase identity, to dismantle the human soul brick by brick. When Sheriff Crawford returned with reinforcements and began the process of carefully extracting the children one by one, the silence was unbearable. The air down there was thick, not just with the stench of waste and mildew, but with something heavier. Shame and hopelessness soaked into every stone. Some of the children flinched when light touched their faces, as if even God's light had become too foreign to trust. Others refused to move without the command of a woman they still called mother. That was perhaps the most haunting detail. These weren't just prisoners. They were programmed. One of the older boys, age 15, reportedly asked Crawford if this was another punishment test. He had been told that false rescue attempts were staged by the outside world to test loyalty to the family. The mind control ran that deep. And yet this is the detail they didn't want public. This wasn't just abuse. This was psychological engineering, conditioning. The very techniques later developed by institutions in the 20th century for interrogation and re-education were being prototyped in a farmhouse basement in 1834. Let that sink in. Constance Sullivan didn't just keep the children alive. She rewrote their perception of reality. She isolated them, erased their names, gave them new ones, turned siblings against each other, created hierarchy with rewards for obedience and punishment for resistance. She made herself their center of gravity. To the outside world, she was a church-going caregiver. But in that basement, she was a god. This model, this system is older than you think. From ancient cults to modern institutions, this blueprint of control has never changed. Shelter them, feed them, strip them of origin, inject fear, and then demand love. The Sullivan basement was the perfect prototype of institutional dominance. And here is the terrifying truth. It worked, because even as the chains were removed, many children looked back, afraid, confused, not because they missed it, but because it was the only world they ever knew. And the question you must ask now is this: what other basements exist that no one has found yet, where the truth is buried not in dirt, but in silence? By the time the children were carried out of the Sullivan basement, the town of Millbrook had already begun to fracture. People were no longer greeting each other in the streets. They were whispering, looking over their shoulders. Some refused to believe the reports altogether, calling it hysteria. Others quietly confessed they had heard things for years. Sounds at night, strange glimpses, voices that didn't match the faces, but they had said nothing. That silence wasn't accidental. It was engineered. You see, what Constance Sullivan had built was more than just a prison beneath her house. She had built a psychological firewall around the entire town, a bubble of reputation, kindness, routine, and carefully planted lies. Every time she bought large amounts of food, she offered an explanation. Every time someone questioned the absence of the children, she had a backstory ready. Every potential suspicion was cut off at the root and replaced with a more comforting truth. It worked because people wanted it to work, because questioning it meant stepping into the dark, and most people would rather protect their comfort than face what lives in the shadows. But something even more disturbing began to emerge as the investigation deepened. The basement wasn't just a secret dungeon. It was a distribution center. The records pulled from the Sullivan house revealed transactions, payments, coded messages, and delivery logs. Some children weren't meant to stay there. They were sent out to places not yet identified, to people not yet arrested. The farm was a waypoint, a station in a much larger system, and that means the Sullivan horror wasn't an anomaly. It was a node in a network that operated in silence beneath the normal. If this one farmhouse in Virginia could hold this many children for this long without being discovered, what else was happening across the country in the mansions of those wealthy? In the basements of orphanages, in the corners of forgotten hospitals and church rectories. You think evil hides in the woods. It doesn't. It hides in routine, in good manners, in charitable reputations and locked doors no one dares open. Constance Sullivan's true genius wasn't her cruelty. It was her ability to make everyone else complicit through inaction. And that's the disease that still survives today. Silence. Willful silence. And unless you kill it now, you'll never know how deep the rot really goes. The arrest of Constance and Ezra Sullivan sent shockwaves through every institution that had once praised them. But what followed was even more disturbing than the initial discovery, because silence wasn't the only thing protecting the Sullivan basement. There were names on the ledgers, names of men with power names that shouldn't have appeared in a place like that. Judges, bankers, clergy, and landowners from 5 different states. Some were donors to churches, others trustees of orphanages. Still, others were local politicians with reputations for charity and righteousness. But the codes in the Sullivan records, cross-referenced with Rebecca's memory, began to crack open a second chamber of horror. This wasn't just one family's depravity. It was a supply chain, a market. And what they were selling was innocence. The ledgers described conditions, quality, temperament, the same way you might describe livestock or tools. It was all done in euphemism, of course. Words like inventory units, temper, and durability. But behind those polite terms were children, terrified, broken children. It became clear that some of the buyers weren't just collectors or abusers. Some were using the children for religious rituals that had long slipped beyond the bounds of Christianity. The basement contained fragments of paper, with Latin phrases, scorched symbols carved into the stone, and strange diagrams that law enforcement couldn't explain. One investigator brought in from Richmond had served in Europe and recognized some of the markings from an occult case decades earlier. He believed the Sullivan network wasn't just trafficking children. He believed it was feeding something older, something darker. Whether that's true or not remains buried in sealed reports and lost archives. But the evidence was undeniable. This operation was protected. Protected by money. Protected by ritual. Protected by institutions that existed to keep the surface clean while the foundation rotted. And the scariest part, many of those names in the ledgers were never arrested. Charges were dropped. Witnesses disappeared. Documents vanished. And the official story soon became just that. Official, a madwoman. A rogue operation, a tragedy contained. But the real story kept spreading underground, through whispers, through warnings, through those who knew too much to ever forget. And now you know it too. Which means the question is no longer what happened in that basement. The question is, what are you going to do with what you've just heard? They sealed the basement within weeks. A local crew under military supervision filled the chambers with concrete, burying what remained beneath a weight of stone and silence. The official statement was that it would prevent disease and contamination. But others knew better. Sheriff Crawford himself resigned shortly after the final inspection, claiming he could no longer sleep through the night. His deputy, Marcus Webb, left town altogether, never to return. As for the children, those who survived the basement, they were placed in care homes across the state, but none of them remained in Virginia. It was as if the government wanted to scatter the evidence like ash in the wind. The story was suppressed. Newspapers published brief statements about a disturbed couple abusing orphans, but the real scale was never mentioned. The records were boxed up and marked as sealed by court order. And just like that, the truth began to sink back into the soil of Henrico County. But something strange began to happen to those who visited the land years later. Surveyors, real estate developers, farmers who purchased plots near the old Sullivan farm, they all reported the same things. Nightmares, screams beneath the floorboards, tools going missing, cold spots in the middle of summer. One foreman claimed he saw a child in the woods, watching him from the edge of the trees, barefoot and thin, and vanished when approached. Eventually, no one wanted to build there. The land was left wild, overgrown, a scar in the earth that refused to heal. Rebecca, now in her late 40s, gave a single interview in 1872 to a reporter from a small abolitionist paper. She described not just the basement, but the feeling of being watched every day, even after rescue. She said there were rules in that house. Ancient ones. Things you could not speak, names you could not say aloud. And when the reporter asked her what the worst part was, she didn't say the chains, or the darkness, or the beatings. She said it was the singing. The soft voice of Constance Sullivan, singing lullabies in the dark every night, her voice echoing off stone. Sweet, gentle words covering screams. She said sometimes she still heard that voice in her dreams, and sometimes it came from under the floor. Even now, even all these years later, they burned the Sullivan farmhouse to the ground, but the fire did not cleanse the land. It was said that the flames danced in unnatural shapes, twisting like limbs, reaching for help. The townspeople gathered on the hill to watch it burn, not out of hatred, but fear. The kind of fear that silences entire generations. Millbrook slowly dissolved after that year. Families moved away. Crops failed. Marriages collapsed and churches emptied. It was as if the entire community had been cursed by proximity alone. No one wanted to speak the Sullivan name again. But the deeper currents of power do not die easily, you see. Constance Sullivan did not act alone. Her meticulous records included more than just buyers and sellers. They named men of cloth, doctors, judges, and a handful of wealthy landowners from across the eastern seaboard. Men with influence, with churches under their sway and courts in their pockets. She had corresponded with them for decades. They funded her, protected her, and when the basement was discovered, those same men ensured the story would be buried. Several children rescued from the Sullivan farm were never placed in orphanages. They were quietly taken into private homes by unnamed benefactors. Their identities erased, their memories, dismissed as hysteria or trauma. Even Rebecca would later tell a nurse that she believed someone was still watching her from the woods, even in the middle of the city. The question that remains is simple and terrifying. Why children? Why so many? And why such effort to conceal the truth? There are whispers among certain circles that the basement had another purpose, that the Sullivan operation was not merely criminal, but ritualistic. The arrangement of the chambers, the symbols scratched into the stone, the strange rhythmic noises heard at night. It all points to something older than Christianity, older than law. Something that feeds on pain. The final report, buried in a locked drawer at the state archives, contained one last line, handwritten by Sheriff Crawford himself before his resignation. It read simply, "Whatever they were doing down there, it was not of this world, and it did not begin with the Sullivans. It will not end with them either." There are truths so dangerous that to speak them is to risk unraveling the world you think you live in. This is one of them. Because the Sullivan basement was not unique. It was part of a map, a lattice of hidden sites across early America, each buried beneath quiet towns and righteous communities. Rebecca's testimony confirmed this. She remembered names. New Hope, Pennsylvania, Willows Reach, South Carolina, Devil's Hollow, Kentucky. Each one described like coordinates in a system built to house the unthinkable. Children taken not just for profit, but for purpose. What purpose? No one will admit it out loud, but the reports found in the farmhouse suggest they were documenting something beyond trafficking. Detailed measurements of emotional responses to fear, hunger, light deprivation. Silence. Experiments on how belief breaks and reforms under pressure. They weren't just hurting these children. They were studying them, breaking the soul to map its pieces. This was not madness. It was method, and method needs a sponsor. That's why when federal marshals attempted to prosecute those implicated in the letters, every case collapsed. Key witnesses disappeared. Evidence was reclassified or lost in fires and floods. Judges dismissed charges citing insufficient proof. And then came the quiet silencing. Newspapers were paid not to report. Families threatened. The Sullivan basement became folklore. And folklore always dies beneath the weight of modern skepticism. But the map Rebecca revealed to investigators did not disappear. It passed hand to hand across decades. Private researchers continued the work unofficially, obsessively. Some say that by the 1920s, the same methods were being used by certain military groups, experimenting with mind control and obedience. Others believe the Sullivan records were the seed of something darker, a doctrine that pain reveals divinity, that control over the mind can lead to control over entire populations. Think about that. An underground system that began with stolen children in rural Virginia could have evolved into institutional programming, a ghost blueprint haunting our modern world. It's not paranoia if it's documented. It's not myth if the scars are real. And those scars did not disappear when the farmhouse burned. They multiplied across children, across states, across generations, because once you teach a system how to break the will, you never really stop using it. You just change the name. By the time the last survivor left the Sullivan basement, the damage had already been done. Not just to the children, but to the fabric of the town itself. Millbrook was never the same. Its people never looked each other in the eyes the same way again. Because evil that close is contagious. It doesn't vanish when the cellar doors close. It seeps into the soil. It lingers in the silence between Sunday hymns. The children who survived were sent to facilities far from Virginia for recovery and reintegration. But most never adjusted. Some ran away again. Some ended their own lives before adulthood. A few tried to tell their stories, but were silenced, dismissed, labeled disturbed or delusional. But one child left behind something else. Rebecca. She wrote everything she could remember, not just the names and dates, but the rituals, the phrases Constance made them repeat, the drawings they were forced to copy over and over, symbols, circles with eyes inside them, branches with roots bleeding down. It wasn't just control, it was belief, a system of dark faith, whispered rules enforced through fear. The children weren't just prisoners. They were converts, converted not to God, but to the doctrine of submission. Obey and be fed. Obey and be spared. Obey, and one day you will be chosen to leave. No one ever left. When Rebecca's writings were discovered years later, in a private home for the emotionally disturbed outside Philadelphia, they were dismissed as trauma-induced hallucinations. But the symbols matched those found scratched into the walls of the Sullivan basement, etched with fingernails and broken spoon handles. Not random, repeated, uniform, deliberate. Who taught them? Who wrote the first one? That's the question that haunts researchers even now. Because if these markings appeared in other locations, if the same doctrine surfaced in other disappearances, then we're not talking apisoma. About one family, we're talking about a doctrine that moves, that survives beyond names and towns, that survives because people refuse to believe it could exist. And that's how it wins. By hiding in plain sight, behind the one phrase no one dares to question. It can't happen here, but it did. And the children left behind knew one truth that should shake every man to his core. Sometimes the devil doesn't hide in darkness. He hides in a smile, and sometimes he calls himself Mother. There's a reason no one talks about Millbrook anymore. It's not on most modern maps. The land was sold, divided, renamed. But those who know the truth never forget. Because what happened in that basement wasn't an isolated horror. It was a prototype, a blueprint for how control systems could be built without walls. How submission could be bred not through chains, but through conditioning. And the Sullivan method worked. Pain was only part of it. The real weapon was belief that no one would save them, that escape was betrayal, that obedience was survival, that their captor was their caretaker. It's the same system used by cults and regimes across history. It's ancient, and it's effective. What the authorities never explained was how so many of the children were acquired. Some came from orphanages. Yes, some were kidnapped off the roads. But records found in the Sullivan papers pointed to a deeper network. Whispers of auctions held in private barns in Pennsylvania and Maryland. Clergymen and doctors who vouched for transfers of custody, legal documents forged or obtained through bribery, even a few local judges involved. It wasn't just a farmhouse operation. It was part of something systemic, institutional. And what's worse, there were plans to expand. Letters recovered from the Sullivan residence included diagrams, not just of the Virginia basement, but of other sites. One in North Carolina, one in Tennessee, and a particularly detailed plan marked Ohio, with the initials CW at the bottom. CW. No one ever confirmed who that was, but those initials would later appear again, carved into the underside of a child's bed frame, recovered in a separate raid in Kentucky in 1841. Same symbols, same punishments, same silence. There's something older here than just one family, a doctrine of domination passed hand to hand, hidden in charity, disguised as religion, shielded by community, and always targeting the forgotten because the poor don't get headlines and the lost don't get found unless someone forces the world to look. That's what this story is. A forced look, a scar peeled open to remind you that evil doesn't die. It adapts. It changes its name. It starts again. When the newspapers finally printed the story, it wasn't the whole story, not even close. The Richmond Times used words like tragedy and madness. The editorials blamed isolation, mental illness, even bad harvests. No mention of the chains, no mention of the coded letters, and certainly no mention of the other farms. The official version was simple and easy to swallow. A woman lost her mind from grief and kept orphans locked away thinking she was helping them. But the survivors told a different tale, not of madness, of method, not of a grieving mother, but of a calculating system builder. And yet the public needed a villain they could pity or hate, not a system they had to question. So Constance Sullivan was made the scapegoat. She was declared unfit for trial, sent to an asylum in Staunton where she died 2 years later in silence. Ezra was never charged, disappeared before the second round of questioning. Some said he went west. Others believed he was buried in an unmarked grave by the same people who once paid him. But those children, those 47 fractured voices, they remembered, and some of them grew up. Most were adopted after years of recovery. Others were sent to institutions where trauma was locked up again, just in different ways. But a few held on. One of them, Thomas Hale, would later become a school teacher in New York. He changed his name and rarely spoke of the basement, until one day, in 1873, when he testified in a trial involving missing children in Pennsylvania. He said one line that would haunt the courtroom. The chains were not the worst part. It was the silence they made us believe in. Another survivor, Maria Carter, became a nurse. She smuggled out written accounts over the years. In them, she described a moment when she almost forgot her real name, when she almost believed she was born in the dark, and that the world above was a lie. You see, that's what real kept. There is something ancient in the architecture of control. It does not always wear robes or uniforms. Sometimes it dresses in aprons and smiles. Sometimes it walks among us as a model citizen. That was the secret to Constant Sullivan's power. She did not hide in the shadows. She stood in the light. She sang hymns with her neighbors. She brought pies to church fundraisers. She prayed louder than anyone, and in doing so she built the most effective camouflage of all: trust. When people trust you, they do not ask questions. When people see your hands clasped in prayer, they never imagine what those hands are really doing when no one is looking. And that's what made Millbrook so complicit, because deep down, many of them knew something wasn't right. They saw too many supplies, too few children in public. They heard noises at night they could not explain. They looked away. And looking away is how the worst things are allowed to grow, because evil does not survive in confrontation. It thrives in avoidance. It feeds on politeness and the desperate need to believe that everything is fine, that no one you know could ever be capable of horror. But history does not support that hope. Every genocide, every abuse, every long-running horror was allowed to continue, because good people chose silence over conflict. And in 1834, Millbrook, that silence buried 36 children and broke 47 more. You see, control doesn't need to be absolute. It just needs to be maintained long enough for the world to stop watching. And the Sullivan case showed exactly how long that can be. Decades, generations even. Until the last witness dies. Until the last ledger turns to dust. Until the basement collapses and becomes just another part of the earth. But some stories claw their way back to the surface. Not because someone told them, but because someone refused to forget, someone like you watching this now and realizing. The courtroom was packed the day Constant Sullivan stood trial, not with strangers, but with the very same neighbors who had once sung beside her in church pews and traded stories on porches. Now they sat in silence, unwilling to meet her eyes as the truth unfolded like a wound split wide open. She wore the same modest black dress she had worn to every funeral in town. But this time she was the cause, not the mourner. The prosecutor presented the records, the chains, the bones, the testimonies of children who could barely speak without shaking, and still some people defended her. They whispered that it was all a mistake, that Ezra must have forced her, that no good Christian woman could ever do such a thing. That is the power of image. Once a mask is worn long enough, it fuses to the skin, and people would rather claw out their own memories than admit they were fooled. But the evidence was undeniable. Photographs were taken, though many would be sealed away by the state. Witnesses wept on the stand. A young boy named Elias stared down the woman who had kept him shackled for 6 years and said 3 words that silenced the room: "You are nothing." The jury took less than an hour to deliver the verdict: guilty on all counts: conspiracy, child trafficking, unlawful imprisonment, murder. When the judge passed sentence, there was no joy, only a hollow weight like air before a thunderstorm: life in prison until death. Ezra Sullivan died by his own hand before the trial began, found hanging in his cell, his confessions scrawled in blood on the wall. They were hers, everyone. But the case did not end there, because when they dug deeper, when they followed the names in the letters, they found something bigger: other farms, other children, other women and men who had learned from Constant Sullivan's methods and spread them like a sickness. It was not an isolated nightmare. It was a system. The deeper investigators looked, the more the ground began to shift beneath them, because the Sullivan case was no longer just about one basement or one town or even one state. It was about how darkness spreads when no one is looking, and how entire systems can be built beneath the floorboards of a society too polite to ask questions. The documents found in Constance's ledger led federal marshals to a farmhouse in North Carolina. There they discovered 5 children locked in a root cellar beneath crates of dried corn and hog feed. A week later, authorities raided a compound outside Atlanta, where another network member had been quietly raising 12 children under false identities. Each location followed the same blueprint: a respected member of a small rural community, a false story of charity or religious duty, a hidden cellar or concealed room, and children trained to fear the world more than the people who imprisoned them. But even more disturbing was what they didn't find. For every lead that led to a rescue, 3 more vanished into dead ends. Homes abandoned, papers burned, names changed. The truth began to emerge slowly, like bones rising through thawed ground. This was not a spontaneous crime born from one woman's madness. It was an organized structure, one that had been evolving for years, maybe decades. And behind it all, whispers of a higher order, a hidden circle of individuals who provided protection in exchange for silence. Judges who had dismissed complaints without reason. Doctors who signed off on death certificates that never should have existed. Church leaders who defended the accused instead of the innocent. One investigator described it as a cathedral of secrets built in the shadows of institutions people were taught to trust. The Sullivans were the rot, but the tree itself was diseased. The more the public learned, the more they recoiled. Letters poured. By the summer of 1835, the Sullivan property was boarded up, the doors chained by order of federal marshals, and the basement flooded with lime to suppress what could never truly be buried. But you can flood a room and still not drown the memory. People stopped speaking the name Sullivan in Millbrook. It was as if the town collectively chose to amputate the limb that had rotted, rather than admit the infection had reached the heart. Constance Sullivan never stood trial. She was found dead in her holding cell. Weeks after her arrest, her cause of death listed as self-inflicted poisoning. Though no one could explain how she obtained the means, Ezra Sullivan was sentenced to life in prison, but died under mysterious circumstances during transport. 2 guards on duty that night resigned without explanation. The surviving children were sent to various facilities, most to overcrowded orphanages, others to distant relatives or families willing to take them in. Their stories rarely made it past a paragraph in the local papers. No follow-ups, no interviews, no justice. Just a line that read, "The children are now in the care of proper authorities." But they remembered. Every corridor, every scream, every promise of food that was a lie. Every prayer they whispered, hoping someone would hear them through the stone. Some of them grew up and tried to speak out. They wrote letters to newspapers, gave interviews to anyone who would listen. Most were ignored. A few were accused of fabrication or madness. Their stories didn't fit the official narrative, because the official narrative had already been sealed in court documents and forgotten histories. What survives are fragments, testimonies locked in university archives, unmarked graves that still whisper beneath the clay, and children's drawings found decades later in the rubble of what used to be the Sullivan farmhouse, simple sketches of chains of sty. There is a reason you have never heard the full story of the Sullivan family. Not in school books, not in documentaries, not even whispered across taverns where old men trade local legends. Because stories like this one are not meant to be told. They are meant to be buried beneath layers of official reports, half-truths, and bureaucratic silence. But here you are hearing it anyway, and that means something has already changed in you. The basement beneath the Sullivan farmhouse was more than a chamber of horror. It was a mirror, a reflection of how easily entire communities can be lulled into blindness by politeness and surface appearances. Every child who vanished into that darkness was not just a victim of 2 monsters. They were victims of everyone who looked away, everyone who nodded politely when Constance gave her gentle excuses, everyone who chose comfort over confrontation. The truth is this: monsters do not hide in caves or wear horns. They sit in pews. They wave to neighbors. They memorize scripture and host charity dinners. But behind their eyes is a cold arithmetic, a knowledge of exactly how much pain can be inflicted before anyone dares to speak. The Sullivan case was not isolated. It was not a glitch in the system. It was the system functioning exactly as it was designed: power unchecked, secrets protected, and the vulnerable crushed beneath the weight of silence. If you've stayed with me this far, it's because you're not like the others. You feel it too, don't you, that this isn't just about one family in 1834. It's about a pattern, a blueprint passed down across generations of those who learned to smile while building their own basements. So here's what I want you to do. Type this phrase in the comments twice so you never forget: no more basements. Not because they're gone, but because they're still being built right now, in new towns with new names and new justs.